Howdy folks, it's Dr. Gabriel Sines once again. We're looking at Introductory Psychology week number 7. This week we're covering memory. Memory is one of my most favorite topics. It's one of my areas of greatest expertise, so I love talking about it, and especially I love talking about it because there's a lot of useful stuff that we can talk about. A lot of stuff that can be useful to your daily life or to your life kind of on a long-term schedule. I'd like to start here by talking about the simplicity and complexity of the human mind and memory systems. We know that the brains that we've talked about for so many weeks already are made of incredibly complicated systems of coordinated interactions of neurons, dividing themselves into specialized areas, functions, and purposes. But remember that each neuron itself is really not that complicated of its own. It follows very basic rules. So how do these neurons accomplish the task of giving us a sense of memory? Well, on the left here, I have a very basic mechanism showing you a system where little marbles fall down, and depending on where the marble has most recently fallen, the system remembers the direction the next marble is supposed to go. And in this way, very simple systems can establish methods of remembering information and altering the future based off of that system of memory. We'll see a couple of videos before we get started showing systems of memory that are outside of biological or human realms, systems of memory made up for computers or for toys that nonetheless give us ideas about how our own memories will work as well. So, before we get started, let's take a quick look at the different sections we'll look at in this chapter. We'll start off by looking at the different memory systems that we use. There's 3 of them, and they interact in interesting ways. Then we'll look at some special sections of memory. The working memory is the memory for all of the consciousness and things that we do in our mind at any given moment. And it has some rules that we've been able to figure out. And if you know how to play the rules, you may know how to use your memory to its greatest extent. Next up, we'll have the long-term memory, including different types of memory. So not only do we have different systems of memory and different ways of working with memory, but there are different formats that we can save our memory information in. And again, these different formats allow us to perform different tasks. We'll then finish off with memory tricks and interesting things, a number of little bits, miscellaneous memory facets that may help you in your daily life. I've got a comic here that I think is really funny. I love it. It's a comic from an online comic that's much longer. And the reason I've got it here is because it does a wonderful job of representing the strange quality that memory imparts in our lives. We do not have an awareness of the universe except through the lens of our memory. When we do things that we don't pay attention to, such as the drive that we take from here to there, it's gone. We don't hold on to it because remembering that drive, that one drive of hundreds of thousands, is pointless, so we don't remember it. When something scary happens, we may remember that very clearly and vividly. So vividly, in fact, that our memory of that scary event is altered over time to a point that it becomes unrecognizable if we were to examine it objectively. Let's take a look at this comic. Boy, Mars, what a twist! Hey, Bear Tato, what's your favorite thing about living on Mars? What? We don't live on Mars. Oh, I thought we did live on Mars. Nope. Hmm. Guess I've got brain problems. What's going on here? I love this comic because it does a wonderful job of showing you, of presenting an idea that whatever you remember is your reality. If you have a conversation with your boyfriend or girlfriend and you remember things that they don't, or they remember things that you don't, the conversation is inevitably going to be a little troublesome because regardless of what did or did not happen, what matters is what you remember. If you don't remember doing something stupid, then you can't take responsibility for it and change it. If you can't forget and something that someone did to you, it's going to be very hard to forgive them for it as well. So let's move on and talk about some more concrete, realistically abstract bits of information. We'll start here. The definition for memory is our ability to hold on to experiences and learn from them. Memory can be stored in quite a few different ways. Within our own minds, of course, we know that we have neurotransmitters and synapses and hormones and DNA. You can even think of the calluses that form on your hands after days of hard work as a form of memory. This video shows you how you can create a system of memory using very, very simple little bits. Marbles, gravity, plastic, knobs. I'd like you to watch this video until you see these 1 and 8s. You'll learn how we can create a system of memory that counts, and you'll learn something called encoding, which is the transformation of information from one system to the next. Go ahead and watch this video until about halfway through when you start seeing these big red circles, and meet me back here in a few moments. I'll give you a second to pause this video and switch into that one. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Did the video make sense? Did you understand how we could create a system for counting? Now, the interesting thing about this system is that it involves something called encoding. Like I said, encoding is the process of transforming information from one system to another. In this marble toy, this Turing Tumble, the system was transformed from a series of marbles here at the top to a series of bits turned in one way or another used to count how many marbles moved through the system. Now, this is called encoding. An important thing to know about encoding is that whenever encoding happens, information can never be created. It can either be perfectly transformed, but most times it will likely have lost some information. Can you think of what information was lost in this Turing Tumble counting system? Well, originally the information was stored as a series of 9 marbles. When it moved through the system counted the number of marbles. What information was lost? The location of the marbles originally, the color, size, shape, weight of the marbles lost, because this system is designed for the purpose of counting. It's not designed to copy the information exactly, it just wants to know how many marbles there are. And in the same way, our own systems of memory may not be designed to copy things exactly, instead they are designed to do different jobs, maybe to count, maybe to remember, maybe to influence the way we feel about things. On this next slide, we have our definition for encoding, the transformation of information from one memory system to another. It usually involves some sort of loss of information, and the amount of and type of information lost depends on the memory systems involved. If the information is being encoded from one memory system to another that is exactly the same, then you probably won't lose any information. But when the systems aren't perfectly the same, there has to be some loss of information because one system was not designed to do everything the other system was doing. Where can we see encoding? Of course, we've seen it in that previous video of the Turing Tumble counting the marbles. In computers, we know that computers take information that we give them, encode that into computer code, which then gets encoded into binary, the language that the physical hardware of a computer works with. In order for us to understand what's going on, it then needs to be re-encoded into code and back into something that we ourselves can perceive. Encoding happens all the time. We learned in the sensation and perception chapter that our eyes use rods and cones to perceive the world, and despite the fact that they're designed to try and copy as much visual information as they can, there are limitations to our eyeballs. Certain colors that we cannot see, brightnesses that are too bright, darknesses that are too dark, speed, information that moving too quickly for us to perceive, and so we will never have a perfect copy of the information that is coming towards us. So even our eyeballs perform a form of encoding before they pass that information off to our conscious minds. In this video, linked here, it starts about a third of the way through, and I'd like you to watch till you see this big face with the X on it, maybe a little bit longer. What's going on in this video is a little bit complicated, so let me preface it before you watch. This is a video that does a wonderful job of explaining encoding in the sense of a computer. The overall video is about a guy trying to create a program that makes original dance moves. How does he do this? He takes a video of thousands and thousands of dance moves. He then encodes them into a series of pictures, and that series of pictures can be used to teach a program how to dance. In order to use those pictures, though, he needs to encode them further, because the pictures have too much information to them. He needs to simplify that information down into just a series of numbers. So in the video starts in this section where he's talking about how he can simplify those dance pictures down into just a series of numbers using a process of encoding. He explains that when you encode information, you can skip all of the information that is duplicated. Well, let me give you an example of that. He'll explain this as well, but I'd like to explain it now so that this video makes more sense, because he speaks very quickly. Let's say that you want to encode a series of smiley faces and frowny faces. All of the smiley faces look the same, and all of the frowny faces look the same. So because there are only two bits of information that you're trying to encode, you don't have to save every bit of information as is. You don't have to save every single smiley face and every single frowny face. All you have to save is the quantity and order of smileys and frownies, and the encoding system can remember exactly what the smileys and frownies look like, such that you can transform a series of pictures into a series of ones and zeros representing smileys and frownies. Therefore, you can save on so much information. In the exact same way that the Turing Tumble was designed to count how many marbles there were and saved on memory space by ignoring everything else, you can save on memory space by counting just the number of smileys and frownies. Therefore, when he's trying to transform the dance pictures into simpler information, he can save it down into its most basic form, and then encode it and decode it several times to teach the computer to dance. Go ahead and watch the video now. You don't have to watch all of it, but if you do, it's pretty fun. I'll give you a moment. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Did you watch the video? Did it make a lot of sense? He talks fairly quickly, so there's no shame in watching it a couple of times. I've seen it at least 20 times now because I think it's really cool and because I wanted to make sure it made sense for this chapter. There's a couple things I wanted to point out. He does a series of encodings and decodings. He explains that the information may be too much for it to handle, so it needs to be simplified down. That's exactly the same way that there's too much visual information in the world, so our eyeballs only capture some of it, and our brains only process some of what our eyeballs capture. Another interesting thing is that the video shows the dancing stick figure, and the program that can show you every single high school yearbook photo using at least 10 sliders. You can imagine that those two systems work on feature detectors, which we learned about in a previous chapter. Simple little bits that do one job, but that together can create very complicated bits of information, such as entire faces. Let's move on. If this stuff makes too much, if this is too much information for you, we can move on with this. Memory is holding information on that we can use later. Encoding is transforming information from one system or another for different purposes. Let's take a look at the modal memory model. The modal memory model is the most famous, most successful, and probably the most accurate description of how memory works in the human mind. It describes 3 different types of memories. That's why it's called the modal memory model, because it describes 3 modes of memory. First, sensory memory, the memory that our eyes and ears and senses have. These hold information for just a moment or two to give our brains time to process them. If you ever hear someone say something to you, but you don't understand what it is for a moment, That's because the information has fallen into your sensory store but hasn't been fully processed yet, so it doesn't make sense. We're going to skip these three boxes for now. Suffice to say that there is a process of processing the information so it makes sense to you. Then we have the short-term memory. The short-term memory is everything you are conscious about. The short-term memory is like the desk in front of you. It holds all of the things that you are working with in any given moment. If you want to notice something, it has to come from the sensory store into the short-term memory. If you want to remember something that you've learned previously, you have to take it from your long-term memory and bring it to your short-term memory. There's a limit to how much information the short-term memory can handle, but it can do things with memory that no other memory system can do, which we will learn in a later section. Finally, the long-term memory, where we put information that we want to hold on to, where we put experiences that were important to us, where we put information for later retrieval. So let's go ahead and get started with the first section, memory systems. We've already looked at a few of them. This is a different version of the same modal memory model. We've got the sensory memory, short-term, and long-term memories. In addition to those, we've got a couple extra bits in between. Between the sensory memory and short-term memory, we have pattern recognition. Pattern recognition is how, when you look at a chair with your eyeballs, your brain understands that it is a chair and puts that information in your short-term memory. Makes sense that this happens somewhere in between there because you usually don't have to think about what a chair is. You just immediately know. It may take less than a quarter of a second, but it does take some time. We also have attention and the filter between the sensory and short-term memory. We can't pay attention to everything that our senses are telling us, so we have to choose to pay attention to some things. The filter is the idea that we completely ignore some things, i.e. we don't notice them at all. But there's another way to ignore things. We could look, see that it's a chair, and choose to ignore it because we're not interested in chairs in that given moment. Let me explain with an example of these two different types of filters and attention. Let's say that, we'll go back to this one here. Let's say that you are looking for your friend in a crowd of people. You receive visual information from your sensory store, but you know that your friend is an adult, so you're not even going to pay attention or notice any children. Useless information gets completely ignored. So then you're going to look at all of the adults in the crowd of people, but you're not going to pay very much attention to most of them because they're not the person you're looking for. So you'll look at them, process their faces, and choose to ignore them as you move on to the next face while you're trying to look at your friend. In that way, we can choose to ignore things completely before we process them for information, or partially after we process them for information so that we can decide that we don't care. There's your attention and filter. We also have a rehearsal between the short-term and long-term memory. When you're trying to hold something in your head, like someone's phone number, what you can do to keep it in your short-term memory is rehearse it. Say it to yourself over and over again. 867-5309. 867-5309. 867-5309. 867-5309. 867-5309. I remember, it's 867-5309. By rehearsing something, by saying it to yourself over and over again, you can keep information in your short-term memory indefinitely. There is a retrieval, the process of getting something back from your long-term memory. The reason it's called retrieval and not remembering is because retrieval describes the process of remembering better than remembering does. The long-term memory can hold potentially an infinite amount of information. It would take hundreds of years for us to fill up our long-term memory. Our memories are not like a library with limited space. Instead, they are more like a forest, vast and unending, full of thousands and thousands of pieces of information. But it can be hard to find the information that you're looking for. So you can imagine that there are various paths leading to the memories that you want. a path leading to the words that you're trying to remember when you're saying something, a path to remember your first memory, the first time you kissed someone, the path to remember the answers to your test. Now, it can be easier or harder to find information or retrieve information from your long-term memory depending on how well the path is maintained. Information that you access often, like what your friend's face looks like, or what your favorite color is, what your name is, has a very well-trodden path. It's easy to follow, easy to find, very easy to get that information out of your long-term memory. But if you have not remembered something, if you haven't thought about your friend from middle school in several years, the path to that memory in your memory forest might be a little bit overgrown. And so finding that path, retrieving that memory might be harder. We don't know whether we actually completely ever forget information, but we can be sure that we can lose the paths to information. We can't prove that you have completely forgotten something, but we can prove that you have forgotten where it is in your memory. You can't purposefully choose to remember it. You cannot retrieve it. So that's why it's called retrieval, because remembering something is more about finding it in your memory than it is about having it in there at all. Okay, the last couple of vocabulary words, interference, decay, and retrieval failure, we will look at in a little bit. Interference and decay are different ways that we forget information. Retrieval failure is exactly as it just described. When we can't manage to remember something, it's called retrieval failure. And there's two reasons why you might fail to retrieve something, either because you didn't save it or because you can't figure out where it is in your memory. Both cases result in retrieval failure, but we can't tell which is the issue, so we just call it bulk retrieval failure. We've got a table here that describes some of the characteristics of these different types of memories. The sensory memory holds information from 0 to 2 seconds. Your eyeballs hold information for about a third of a second. The information there is saved in about as a literal copy as it possibly can be saved, and the amount of information that we can hold in our sensory memory is variable, depending on the type of sense and the type of information there. And the main forgetting mechanism for our sensory memory is decay. And we don't know what decay is, so let's go ahead and move on. We'll come back to this slide after we learn about that. So here are the two types of forgetting. Decay forgetting and interference forgetting. Decay forgetting is when you forget information over time. The information is simply lost. It decays. We lose it because time has passed. Interference forgetting is when we forget information because other bits of information have taken its place. So you can imagine that decay forgetting is kind of like memories fading away, dissolving in the wind, whereas interference forgetting is something else replacing it. It's hard to remember which superhero was presented here because another superhero takes his place very quickly afterwards. So if we go back to this chart here, it says that we mostly forget information in our senses due to decay. Like I said, the memory for your eye doesn't last more than a quarter of a second, so information is decaying constantly. But it doesn't need to last very long there, because the whole purpose of the sensory memory is just to allow our information to get processed into the short-term memory. So let's take a look at the short-term memory characteristics. Information in our short-term memory stays there for maybe 30 seconds, but if we rehearse it, it could stay there for a very, very long period of time. The short-term memory store prefers to hold information in phonological encoding. What does that mean? Well, usually when we work with information in our short-term memory, we think about it in terms of words. Take a moment now and think. What do you think in? Do you think in words? Do you think in pictures? Can you think in ideas? Take a moment. This is a wonderful little experiment. Most people recognize that they think in words. You can talk to yourself in your head, for sure. Can you think in ideas? Well, if you're not sure whether you can think in ideas, try this. Or sorry, if you're not sure whether you can think in pictures, try this. Imagine a cube in your head. Paint it green. Now rotate the cube. What you're doing is definitely a visual, an image. There's no words to what you're doing right now. So you must be able to think in visual information. The hardest one to understand is thinking in ideas. Do you think in ideas? Most people don't really think they do, but I promise that you do. Let me give you an example. If you are trying to explain something, but you can't quite find the words, you must be thinking in ideas. If when you wake up in the morning and you know what you want to do, but you don't really have the capacity to speak yet, you must be thinking in ideas. If you're trying to say something, but you can't quite remember the word you're looking for, you must be thinking in ideas. I promise you, people think in ideas all the time, but it's hard to think about your thinking. When you think about your thinking, you usually think about it in terms of words. That's why a lot of our short-term memory is in terms of words. It makes sense that if we're trying to understand something, we would think in terms of words. Everything that's ever been explained to us has been explained in words. Things that we figure out on our own, we think about in terms of ideas. But before we can explain that to someone else, we have to turn them into words. So everyone uses words and pictures and ideas, but it can be hard to notice when you're doing one or the other. One more example there. There are certain types of people who may think more in ideas or more in words or more in pictures. Depending on just who you are, you may have one or the other more often. People with autism have a higher likelihood to think almost entirely in ideas compared to words. Sorry, almost entirely in pictures compared to words or ideas, because that's kind of how their mind works. Let's go back to the slides here, because I've been talking about interesting stuff, but we're going off on a little bit of a tangent. I hope that information was interesting, but you don't need to remember all of that stuff. In fact, this chart is just for your own benefit. Next up, how much information can we hold in the short-term memory? 7 plus or minus 2 chunks. We'll learn more about what that means later on. And how do we forget information in our short-term memory store? Mostly interference. Because the short-term memory is everything that we are conscious of in any given moment, there is constantly information coming into our short-term memory from our senses and from our long-term memory. So it's very, very easy to forget information. There's really almost no time for us to forget information due to decay. Finally, characteristics of the long-term memory store. It lasts potentially indefinitely. The information is stored semantically, meaning ideas. There is a potentially infinite size to the long-term memory, and the way we forget information is not really through forgetting, but a form of interference. If we go back to our forest example, it's not that we forget information. It's not that the information is gone from the forest, but because we chose to tread one path or another path, it becomes harder and harder to find the paths that we haven't worked with. So in that way, there is interference. Okay, we're going to go through each one of those sections of memory briefly, but mostly to look at examples. So let's take a look at the sensory memory. Remember, this is the memory that your senses hold for just a moment to allow you the opportunity to process that information into your short-term memory store. The interesting thing about the short-term memory is that decay happens all the time and interference happens all the time. So this video will do a wonderful job of showing you exactly that. Go ahead and watch until you see the example with the man and the oranges. It's about 5 minutes long there, and you can watch the rest of it if you like, just for fun. Come back here when you're done. I'll give you 3 seconds to pause this video and watch that one. 3, 2, 1. Wasn't that interesting? I love that video. I think it does a great job of showing you how strong your sensory memory can be. Now, can you identify the different types of forgetting that happened in that video? I promise they showed you both decay and interference. The checkerboard pattern represents interference. The checkerboard pattern is something else for your sensory memory to look at. So when you look at that, you forget the other pictures. It interferes with those other pictures. What about decay? Well, they presented the checkerboard pattern for different amounts of time. Remember that your sensory memory lasts anywhere from 0 to 2 seconds, and the sensory memory for your vision lasts only a quarter or a third of a second. So if the checkerboard pattern was presented for 1 second, then you had both interference and decay forgetting. Interference because the checkerboard pattern replaces the picture in your eyes, and decay because the checkerboard pattern is there for longer than your sensory memory can hold on to the original picture. If the checkerboard pattern was presented for 0.1 seconds, then you have interference because the checkerboard pattern gives your eyes something else to look at. But you don't have decay because your sensory memory can remember the original image for longer than 0.1 seconds. Next, let's take a look at attentions and filters. On the bottom left, we've got a nice primate who is doing a cool task, playing a game where he has to press a series of numbers on a screen in the order of the numbers. The trick is that the numbers are only presented until he presses or she presses the first number, which means that they have to look at the information and memorize it and then press all the numbers. Of course, in order to do it this quickly, he does not really use his short-term or long-term memory to remember the numbers. He's mostly relying on his sensory memory. He can look at all of the picture and press the one, and in the quick moments between each presses, figure out where each number is. Of course, he's practiced this for hours and hours and hours, so if you practiced it as much as he had, you would be just as good as him. But it makes sense that we can use our sensory memory to do tricks like this because it gives us a tiny little window to process information, and if we've processed that information well enough, or we're used to processing that information well enough, we'd be really, really good at it. Now, this slide was all about attention. Of course, we see the monkey can pay attention to 10 numbers in one moment, but what happens when we are unable to pay attention to everything? Go ahead and watch this first video in this first link. Pay very close attention to the instructions and do your best to remember how many times the basketball gets tossed between the white team or the black team. I don't remember which one it tells you to do. I'll give you 3 moments to do that. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Did you find that video interesting? I love it. This is one of those things that I would not be a good intro psychology teacher if I didn't present it to you. What happens is you're paying so much attention to the ball passes that you may not have noticed the dancing bear or gorilla. Why don't you notice the dancing gorilla? Well, all of your attention is focused on the ball passes, so you use a filter to ignore everything else. You don't care about the other team, and you don't care about the gorilla, so you don't notice it at all. Not noticing information like that is called an early filter. You ignore it before you have a chance to notice it. The late filter is when you pay attention to things just enough so you can choose to ignore it. The video on the bottom here has a discussion and description of the early versus late filter forms of attention. Go ahead and give that a watch. It's optional, but it gives you a little bit of interesting information, an introduction to an important discussion in psychology. I'll give you 3 seconds before we move on. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so let's talk about the short-term memory. We've mostly talked about this already. It's the part of your mind that you are conscious of. It's got lots of interference because all the information you're conscious of goes there. You can use rehearsal to repeat information to yourself and keep it in your working memory, and there really isn't very much chance for decay because interference is happening all the time. We've said pretty much everything we want to say about it, so I'll move on quickly to the long-term memory. We've got a video here representing the long-term memory, where you hold information while you're not working with it. The video represents the long-term memory as a storehouse. Like I said, the storehouse analogy is imperfect. We do not have any particular limit to the size of our memory, but we do have a limit to how much memory we can find, how well organized we can keep our minds. So the idea that if you learn how to use a laptop, you have to forget how to do high school math may be nonsensical. It has more to do with how often you use high school math that you can remember or not remember high school math. So let's go ahead and move on to the short-term working memory section. The working memory is the system of memories that we can use to manipulate and work with information in different ways. Let's start off by asking you a simple question. Do you multitask? Do you multitask often? I'd like you to think about this. When you multitask, what things can you successfully multitask on, and what things are too hard to do at the same time? For example, I have a lot of trouble answering emails and listening to a podcast because both of them have to do with words. Are there any things that are really hard for you to do or easy? Like, many people say that they study with music, but they prefer music that doesn't have words, or music that they're so familiar with that they don't have to pay attention to the words. Can you think of examples on your own? I'll give you a moment before we move on. 3, 2, 1. So, the working memory can classify short-term memory into a number of different sections, and we can use those sections to explain how these different types of multitaskings can work or not work. First, we'll look at the different sections. You've got the phonological loop. Each one of these three sections here holds a type of information and has a special ability. The phonological loop handles language and audio information, phonological, and it can be used as a loop, the thing where you can repeat information to yourself to remember it. It's very hard to repeat a picture to yourself, but you can say things in your head over and over again, right? Next up, the visuospatial sketchpad. Visual, visual information; spatial, spatial information; sketchpad, the special ability, the ability to manipulate that information. Let's give you a couple interesting examples for that. First, the cube rotation that we did earlier. If you hold a cube in your mind and rotate it, that is a sketchpad at work. The sketchpad handles a bunch of different things like math, picturing, helping you walk and organize the ways in which you move. If you're trying to navigate, you can use your visuospatial sketchpad. Try this. Think about where your closest bathroom is. It's probably not too far from you. Without moving, can you close your eyes and walk there? Can you point the direction it is from you? Okay, that's not too hard, but let's try a harder one. Can you think of your closest friend's house? Do you know where that is? Can you navigate there in your mind? Can you point to it? I bet you that your friend's house is farther away from you than the closest bathroom. And it may not be a surprise that the farther something is away from you, the harder it is to manipulate that information or work with it in your visuospatial sketchpad. You can imagine you have a type of map in your head, and things that are farther away on that map take longer to get to in your head. Now, of course, these are just thoughts, so there's no reason for it to take longer for you to get there in your head. But the reason it does is because you have to manipulate that mental map that you have. And the more you manipulate it, the longer time it takes to allow that manipulation to happen. I have one more example for you, and this example does not work very well with just one person. But I'll tell you right now. Though I'll give you a modified version of the example and then I'll explain it to you. I'd like you to picture in your head a rabbit and an elephant. Have you got those in your head? You can picture them whatever way you like. Imagine everything you can about them. Picture them clearly. I'm going to ask you a question, and I'd like you to come up with the answer as soon as you can. The question is about the picture you're holding in your head, so any answer is fine as long as it represents what you actually have. Okay, what color is the rabbit's nose? So whatever color you said doesn't matter. What I'd like you to think of is how you got to that answer. The rabbit in your head was probably very little because you're trying to imagine both a rabbit and an elephant, so you have to be kind of zoomed out. in order to see the color of the rabbit's nose, you probably had to zoom in to the rabbit's face and look at the color of the nose. Why would you need to do that? You could have pictured a rabbit that's the size of an elephant. You could have simply known the color of its nose, since you're imagining it in your own way. But no. Because the sketchpad simulates information the way it works in the real world, you would imagine, naturally, a rabbit that's very small compared to an elephant that's very big. Because the rabbit's very small, you're further away from its nose, maybe too far away, to see its color, so you have to mentally zoom in to the rabbit's nose before you can answer the question honestly. The original version of this example asks half the class to have a rabbit and an elephant, the other half imagining a mosquito and a rabbit. The half of the class that's imagining the mosquito and rabbit have little to no trouble answering the question immediately, because in their imagination the rabbit is huge and the rabbit's nose very obvious. So the way it works is that the people who are imagining the mosquito and rabbit are supposed to answer very quickly, whereas the ones who are imagining the rabbit and elephant very slowly. You then explain, of course, that the reason half the room can answer the question more quickly is not because they're smarter, but because their imagination was better poised to answer the question. Okay, the episodic buffer. The episodic buffer holds information. Its special ability is that it can hold information of multiple different types. Unlike the phonological loop or visuospatial sketchpad, which handle language and visual information, the episodic buffer can handle multiple types of information at the same time, such as sights, sounds, smells, sensations, thoughts, ideas, whatever you want. It's called the buffer because when you remember information from your long-term memory, it goes here first before you remember it, before it gets processed in one of these other two guys. The last part of the working memory is the central executive. The central executive is the thing that is in control of these three different systems. It's called the central executive because you can kind of think about it as the president of these memories. Its special job is to pay attention and make decisions. Whenever you use any one of these types of working memory, you are also using the central executive. If you're trying to remember audio information by repeating it to yourself in your head, it takes some attention. If you're trying to remember where you parked your car with your visuospatial sketchpad, it takes some attention. And so if you're trying to remember a phone number and figure out where you parked your car at the same time, you may not have enough attention to do both jobs. That's where your kind of overall capacity exists, your ability to pay attention to things. Okay, so on this slide I've got kind of a summary of the different jobs that each of these working memory sections do. You can think of the phonological loop as your inner ear. It handles reading and hearing, holding and rehearsing language information, understanding language and sound, producing your own words. Now, the phrase here, text is converted to sound first, brings up an interesting idea. How do you read? You have to look at the information with your visuospatial sketchpad or your inner eye. But after you look at it, then your phonological loop, the inner ear, has to understand what you saw. It's an interesting dichotomy there where these two have to work together in order for you to read. And in actuality, you have to use all three because your episodic buffer then has to hold that information while you remember what it means in your from your long-term memory. So reading is actually one of the most intensive processes that you can make your mind do. What else does a visuospatial sketchpad do? It works with vision and image-based thought. It allows you to use vision-based memory. It handles the early process of reading, looking at the letters and understanding what they are. It allows you to count and do math, as well as work with spatial or kinesthetic information, body information. The episodic buffer, finally, is a multi-mode memory store system. It helps you do logical reasoning. Makes sense that you would have to use the episodic buffer to hold like pros and cons, or several characteristics about something. The episodic buffer might be responsible for our consciousness, since it allows for the experience of multiple different things at the same time. It helps us maintain goals, remembering what we want to do, allows us to perform long-term retrieval. We can relive memories in the episodic buffer because we can kind of watch them as they happened before. We can schedule tasks in the episodic buffer. It helps us solve problems and suppress irrelevant information. Okay, so next up we've got the different types of long-term memories. I know that this is the third section out of 4 in this chapter, but we're on slide 18 of 52, so I'll try and go through the long-term memories section and then finish off this video before we start the second one. Have you ever seen this movie? Do you know what it's called? It's called Inside Out, and it does a wonderful job of representing a number of systems, psychological systems. One of our activities, in fact, allows you to watch a movie, such as Inside Out, and write a brief report on what you learned about it and what things are related to psychology in the movie. So if you want to do that, it's a fun activity, especially if you like watching movies. Okay, so the types of memory that we work with can be divided in a couple of different ways. There are explicit and implicit memories. Explicit memories are those that we are consciously aware of, that we purposefully choose to remember. Implicit memories are those that we are not consciously aware of and that come about in our minds automatically, naturally, without our choosing to do so. Can you think of explicit versus implicit memories? Let me break those down for you just a little bit more and they'll make more sense. Within explicit memory, we have episodic memory. Episodic memory is memory for specific events, a specific time. Can you remember the last time that you ate? Can you relive that memory? That is a single specific time and place. Episodic memories are rich with a lot of detail, but they feel so very real. But because they feel so very real, they can be deceiving. They are one memory, and because they are only one memory, there is very little to back up that information. Semantic memories are memories for things you know. Can you remember the specific time, the first time that you learned how to make green? You know how to make green, right? How do you make green? It's blue plus yellow. Can you remember the one time that you learned that? Probably not. You probably do not have an episodic memory for when you learned what green is. Instead, semantic memories are an average of multiple memories put together. You've experienced blue and yellow make green several times, enough that the information has been distilled into something you just know. You don't know necessarily when you learned it, but you don't need to know that, because the information that's useful is the information itself. Semantic memories are an average of memories, like I said, so they are harder to get wrong compared to episodic memories, but we can still sometimes make mistakes. Next up, implicit memories are memories that we don't purposefully choose to remember, memories that come about automatically, naturally, or without our control. An example of an implicit memory is priming. Remember, we learned about priming in a previous chapter when we saw how people can be primed to want more candy if they have just been working with money, or primed to not help someone if they have been primed to feel independent. So it makes sense that priming can affect us in ways that we don't necessarily want it to affect us. Excuse me. There are many ways that priming can affect us. For example, if you when you enter into your classroom for psychology, you're primed to think about psychology. If you go to your French classroom, it's going to be harder to remember psychology and easier to remember French, because the context of the classroom, the time of day, even the people who you're with, prime you to remember one thing over another. Okay, finally, procedural memory. This one's kind of the hardest to understand, but it also is the most inane or obvious. Procedural memory is memory for things that you do. It includes muscle memory, memories of how things work, memories of how to use different things. For example, you have a procedural memory for how to get food from McDonald's, how to go to the bathroom. You have procedural memory for what chairs look like, because you don't even have to think about what a chair is. You just look at it, know implicitly that it's a chair, and move on. You don't have to work on that information because it's so innate in you that it's procedural. Let's talk about an interesting quality of explicit versus implicit memory. It turns out that amnesic people can not remember explicit information, but they can remember implicit information. Feel free to go to YouTube and look up videos of people with amnesia. What you'll find is that they can remember their names, they remember their family members, they remember how to walk and talk and play the piano, all things that they have learned so deeply that they have become procedural information. You can also prime people with amnesia. You can make them sad, and even though they've forgotten why they're sad, they will be sad. In the movie 50 First Dates, the girl feels happiness and sadness, and even though she might forget why she's happy or sad, the days after her dates, she feels overwhelmingly happy, without necessarily understanding why. In the movie Finding Dory, Dory is able to remember how to read. She's able to remember her long-term friends and the emotions that have been resulting from the moments prior, even though she forgets all the specific informations of what's going on in every given moment. Let me give you an example of a couple experiments that really hammer home the differences between explicit and implicit memory. These work with people who have amnesia. There was once a patient who had amnesia so badly that he would have only a 30-second memory, and he definitely would not remember anything from the previous day. He spent most of his days being studied by psychologists. He would go to the offices of different psychologists, or he was chaperoned there, and they would work with him for research purposes. So one of those psychologists one day met him. He had to meet each one of these psychologists every day because he didn't remember them. And when he met him, he shook his hand, and this particular psychologist chose to put a thumbtack in the palm of his hand so that when our amnesic test subject shook his hand, he was pricked. Ow, that hurts. Within minutes or hours, he had forgotten that he had been pricked. But the next day, when he came back to meet that same psychologist, he went to shake his hand but drew it back. When asked, "Why did you not shake my hand?" he said, "Because you're going to prick me. I think you have a thumbtack in your hand. I don't know why, but I don't want to do that." He couldn't remember the fact that he had been pricked, but he did have this priming or this procedural fear that that had happened. In a way, you could say that he had been conditioned to that. One more example. Amnesics can be primed. They can remember procedural information, but they can't remember explicit information. So you'd imagine that on a memory test, an amnesic person would fail completely. Well, it turns out that we can make memory tests for primed memory, for implicit memory. Here's how they work. People with amnesia and people without amnesia take a look at a series of words, such as metal, tree, wood, apple. They are not given a normal memory test. Instead, they are then shown a second series of words. Some of the words in the second series were words they had already seen, and some of the words were words they hadn't seen before. Their job was to simply read what the words were. Now, there was something special about these words. They were presented something like this. The word was written out. Oops, let me see if I can write it out. Why isn't it not letting me do that? Let's see, can we use a highlighter? Oh, I can't draw. Oh, now it's working. Shoot. Pen and red ink. Okay, it lets me draw there. So, let's draw this example out. So the words for this experiment in the second phase looked like this. I saw the word metal, and they just had to say the word. But the trick was that the words had kind of bits cut through them so that they weren't that easy to read. This would be a test of priming because the words that they had seen before were read faster, recognized faster than the words they hadn't seen before. Since they had seen them before, they were primed to read them, better able to read them more quickly, and they could read them more easily. The interesting thing is that both the amnesics and the non-amnesic participants were able to successfully took these priming memory tests and had the same results. They remembered the words that had been primed just as quickly as each other group. Sorry about that. I hope that example made sense. It took me a moment to get it working there. Usually I just write it on the board. So I got a couple of summarizing slides here. Episodic memory is memory for specific events. It's the memory that you remember. So an example here at the bottom left, I remember eating a chicken dinner last night. It smelled good and I used a fork to eat it, and my wife was to my left and the mashed potatoes were steamy. A semantic memory is memory for things you know. I ate a chicken dinner last night. Finally, procedural memory is memory for things that you do. So an example of a procedural memory would have to be an explanation of how to use a fork to eat that chicken. To summarize it in simple phrases, episodic memory is memory you remember, semantic memory is memories of things you know, and procedural memory is memories of things you can do. Okay, levels of processing. Levels of processing is the idea that the more effort you spend on working with a certain bit of information will result in easier or harder remembering, result or better or worse memory for that information. Let's say that you process something in shallowly, such as you just look at it for visual information. Like when you look at a word, instead of reading it, you just check how many vowels are in the word. That's considered shallow processing, and you won't remember that information very easily. Next up, phonetic or acoustic processing. A little bit deeper, let's say you look at a word and think about, does the word rhyme with mad? Because you have to process it both visually and phonologically, you've worked on it with more effort, resulting in a deeper level of processing and better memory for that information. Finally, you have semantic processing. Processing something for meaning. You have to look at it, understand what the word is, and then think about what it means based on your memory. So you might look at a word and ask yourself, is this related to medicine? Semantic processing is about the deepest type of processing you can accomplish, and it results in the best memory. We've got a chart here showing an example study. In this study, people were shown a series of words. For each one of the words, they were asked to answer a yes or no question. Either, was the word written in capitals, does the word rhyme with happy, or is the word a type of fruit? Depending on the type of question the word was presented with, the words were remembered better or worse on a later memory test. Words that were processed very shallowly, just visually, were remembered at about a 10% rate, whereas words that were processed for semantics were remembered almost at 90%. Even though the questions were all yes or no questions, the effort required to understand and answer the question dictated how much they remembered the words. The reason I present or require you to do your vocabulary assignments in the way I do is based off of these ideas. Your vocabulary assignments require you to write the words out. It takes time to write those words out, and it takes more time to write them out with a pen or a pencil than it would keyboard. So that should result in better processing. You're required to write the words with your own definitions instead of simply copying the definitions. Of course, that means that you're processing the words semantically, so that should result in the best memory possible. In that way, your vocabulary homework is designed to help you learn and remember the vocabulary for our tests. Okay. We've got one more interesting thing we'll see here, and I think I'll probably end the video there because it's already been an hour long and you're probably starting to get bored. So we'll do something fun to finish off. There are two different types of recalling. There are probably more types than that, but the most you work with are going to be recognition and recall tests. A recognition test is a test that requires you to simply recognize information, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a test. For example, a multiple choice test is a recognition test, but when you look at the logos of fast food restaurants as you're driving along the street, you don't really need to remember what those logos look like specifically. As long as you can recognize those logos, you're good. It makes sense that recognizing a logo is very easy, whereas remembering a logo, recalling it specifically, is much harder. So for this example, I'd like to give you a moment to draw out the Burger King logo, or the Starbucks logo, or the Apple logo, or all three. Feel free to color it, draw it as best as you can, give it your best shot. What you're doing is you're being requested to recall information that you normally only work with in recognition. Go ahead and pause the video here in the next 3 seconds until you finish drawing it out. 3, 2, 1. Okay, have you finished your drawing or drawings? In the next slide, we'll see the correct version. We've got here the actual Burger King logo, as well as examples of some logos that people have drawn. Did you draw a crown or write BK? There's no reason for you to do so. The logo never included those bits of information, but we know that Burger King is very strongly related or associated to the crown and the BK phrase. Here are examples of the logo through history. Did you draw a logo that had the burger? If you're old enough, you may remember what this logo looked like. In the next slide, we have a series of examples from the top left, the least accurate, to the bottom right, the most accurate recollections of the Burger King logo. On the list here, we have data about how people do. About 20% of people remember the logo almost perfectly. 10% of people draw a full circle around the logo, which is not quite right. 20% of people draw the old logo, so probably if you're taking intro psychology, you don't remember the old logo, but a fair few people draw a crown. Interesting. It makes sense that because we normally only recognize the logo instead of recall it, our recollection for the logo is not as good as our recognition for the logo. On the next slide, we have examples of Starbucks and Apple logos. So if you want to draw those, make sure you do so now, because I'm turning the page in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so here are these two different sets of logos. Once again, you see most folks kind of get them wrong. When I think of the Starbucks logo, I think of this concentric circles with the black mermaid in the middle. For Apple, I remember this rainbowy sort of logo. I especially remember this blue logo because they were on the computers that I had in my elementary school. But what else did you draw? Do you remember what these logos were? How accurate were you? Did you put a dog in the Starbucks logo or something weird looking? I hope this shows you the differences in how our memory works in recall versus recognition. The next video is going to cover memory tricks and interesting things. I think it won't be as long as this video, even though there are quite a few slides in the next one. I hope you've enjoyed this chapter so far, and I wish you a wonderful day. I'll be back soon with the second part of the memory chapter. Take it easy, y'all.